Debra Medina. She is a Republican candidate for governor. Now, we've heard of Kay Bailey Hutchison. We've heard of Rick Perry. But now we have another person in the race. Good morning, Miss Medina.
Good morning, Jesse. Great to be with you this morning.
Obviously, you're going up against a couple of heavy hitters. Why did you decide to get into the Republican primary for governor?
Well, I tell you, I often say it's David and two Goliaths. You're right, heavy hitters. Unfortunately, both of them, I think, have forgotten about we Texans, and seems that their allegiance is more to international business and international bankers. And when folks approached me last fall and said, would you consider running, I knew immediately that I didn't like the policy positions of either of the two options that Texans were likely to have. And it took me several months to get there, but decided to step into that ring, and we're fighting very hard for every inch of ground and having a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of activity around the campaign, and I'm glad to be talking to West Texas this morning.
Debra, let me ask you, what differentiates you from either the current governor or Senator Hutchison?
I will walk the talk. I think both of them have demonstrated in their policies that their allegiance, as I said, is not to limited conservative government ideas. It's not to individual responsibility. It is to bigger and bigger government. Kay demonstrated that probably most visibly and most recently last October when all of the country understood bailing out failed businesses, Wall Street bankers and such, was not in the best interest of the American people. But more importantly than that, it violated the Constitution. There was no proper role of government to be intervening in that way. Rick has let us down time and time again on health care, on the border, on parental rights, on private property protection. The list just goes on and on. And so here's someone who is one of us, who's been out there working hard for a living her whole life, who's been active at the grassroots level, and who now says enough is enough, by golly, I'm going to get in here and fight. Texas is going to lead not only in Texas, but when Texas begins to implement truly limited government policies at the state level, begins to get off the back of our people, our economy will gin like we haven't seen it functioning in years, and the rest of the country will see, and we really believe, that as goes Texas, so goes the nation. We'd like to be leading in that recovery, and so fighting hard in this race.
If you have questions for Debra Medina, call 498-7505, 498-7505. Get to know her, get to know who's running for governor, or toll-free 866-530-0550.
Let's go ahead and take a call, if we could. Good morning. You're on News Talk 550 KCRS with Debra Medina.
Good morning. Yes, I have a question for Ms. Medina. Regarding this last year when President Obama's stimulus was coming out, Governor Perry had commented that he did not want to accept some of the stimulus money because of the way that Texas would then be required to be under the federal government's watchful eye regarding the unemployment insurance. And I'd like to get her take on that situation.
Okay.
Did you hear the question?
I did. The governor did a lot of theatrics, I guess, around rejecting $550 million of a $17 billion package. We've, in fact, used that package to balance this year's state budget. And if we look historically, our strings, the strings by which, maybe we should say the huge ropes by which we are now bound to the federal government, have grown tremendously under the governor's leadership. He has sought more and more federal intervention in Texas, has entirely forgotten about, disregarded the 10th Amendment. We've got a lot of work to do to restore state sovereignty in Texas, and to begin to cut those apron strings, keep our resources here, and stand on our own 2 feet. I would have looked for additional ways to reject, but I certainly wouldn't have been building the kind of relationship dependency on the federal government that we've seen built over the last 8 or 10 years here in Texas.
Okay, we've got a couple more calls to take. Let's try one more. Good morning. You're on News Talk 550 KCRS with Debra Medina.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Ms. Medina. Just a couple of questions. It's pretty easy. I'd like to know your stance on the tax test and how much time we spend preparing our kids for one little test, and also your stance on Texas gun laws like concealed handgun and maybe even an open carry law.
Did you catch those, Deborah?
I think so. You know, education is certainly one of those unfulfilled promises. I think many of us have been active grassroots Republicans. Thought 4 years ago when we had a Republican state legislature for the first time since Reconstruction and Republican statewide office holders that we were really going to see some changes and some improvements in education outcomes. Instead, we got more money thrown at education and a new business margins tax. I think fundamentally we all understand that monopolies produce poor products that cost us a lot of money. We have got to tear down some of the sacred walls that we've erected around public education, understanding that it is, in fact, competition that gives us the best products and services available to the most people for the least amount of money. So with regard to that tax test, that is that monopoly trying to convince us that the outcomes are improving. In fact, they're not improving. The dropout rate in this state should cause us all great concern, especially in the Latino community where it exceeds 50%. We've got a lot of work to do in Texas. I'm pushing real hard to say let's start with this idea that we have to have competition in public education. That is what gives us the best products and services is a competitive environment. How we go about doing that, I think we need some time as a state to have that conversation because we've not been focused in that vein. Gun laws, you're going to find me a big proponent of open carry. You're going to find me a big proponent of advocating that there are two elements essential to freedom, and those are private property ownership and gun ownership, and we must not compromise or surrender either one of those. I'm going to push real hard to protect private property rights in Texas, and in fact am making a pretty solid case for we don't own our property. We rent it from our local municipalities. That's got to stop. Property tax needs to be eliminated in Texas, and gun ownership needs not be infringed as our founders intended with the Second Amendment.
Whoa, did you just say property taxes need to be removed?
Eliminated in their entirety. Yes, sir, I did.
How would you fund government in the state of Texas?
You know, I think that we have to have that fixed in our mind that, in fact, property ownership and gun ownership is what makes us free. And when we get that, when we understand that that's what distinguishes us from a man that lives enslaved in a dictatorship or in a socialist or communist kind of country, the thing that sets us apart in a constitutional republic is that private property ownership and gun ownership. Man will work hard and he will produce when he gets to keep the fruit of his labor. Get that. Say you won't compromise those two things. Then we can have the discussion about how we fund the necessary elements of government. But I believe that that is through a broader-based sales tax. And, in fact, if we broaden the sales tax base in Texas, we can actually lower the rate, the state rate, from 6.25% to about 6.1%. and replace every property tax dollar that's currently being raised in Texas. It's a much better way to load the economy to raise the revenue that's necessary for those government services that we must have. Getting rid of property tax allows that burden to be spread. Using a consumption tax allows it to be spread over the entire economy. We would see a $3 billion increase in net personal income in Texas. We'd add 125 to 175,000 new jobs over the next 3 to 5 years. It's the right thing to do. It gives us back property ownership, and it's good for our economy.